Hi Year 12, today I'm going to talk you through Chapter 15 of Dracula. As you can probably see by the list of homodiegetic narrators, it's a much shorter chapter. This is the rising action in preparation for the climax of the kind of centre of the novel, wherein Lucy is decapitated by the good guys, the forces for good. If you look at the reflection sheet, or if you've had a look at the reflection sheet, which I want you to do after you've watched this video, I'm going to try and talk you through some of the key concepts from that: sensationalism, romanticism, and some of the ideas from Phyllis Roth's essay, Suddenly Sexual Women in Dracula. So, good quality annotations. Let's go. Chapter 14 ended on a cliffhanger wherein Van Helsing had just said to his good friend and his mentee, John Seward, that Lucy made those marks in the child's neck. The reaction of Seward to that disclosure is one of incredulity. He can't believe it. And you can see that with the interrogative, are you mad? Madness is obviously a trope within the Gothic genre. This the tension that is generated when the reader is unsure of the legitimacy of a character's viewpoint is a really useful tool, in that it generates a feeling of perturbation and concern, which are important in creating tension and excitement as well. So yeah, he asks, are you mad? But then he looks at Van Helsing's face and you can see tenderness there. You can see on this slide that I've circled in red pen, the abstract noun tenderness, and in the next paragraph I've also circled in red pen the adjective gentle, because I want to remind you that Van Helsing as a character is portrayed as a father figure, and these two lexical choices certainly contribute to that characterization. And this characterization, this tender, gentle characterization, helps to combat the interpretation that he might be mad. Okay, Van Helsing has to explain why it is that he's taken so long to disclose this to John Seward. And he says, why take so long to tell you so simple a thing? Was it because I hate you and have hated you all my life? Was it because I wish to give you pain? Was it that I wanted now, so late, revenge for that time when you saved my life and from a fearful death? No. So what we've got here is we've got a pattern of interrogatives which are finally answered with no. Therefore, we've got hyperphora, a question which is followed by an answer. So you can see here that his argument is that he has no reason to make this up. Okay. Of course, one of the key reasons why Seward won't believe this is because it is an abstract truth, and this is something that Van Helsing refers to it as here. You can see I've highlighted that noun phrase, abstract truth. This is interesting because I think that's almost like a synonym for a fantasy. An abstract truth, just like an abstract noun is something that you can't really see, something that you can't really understand. An abstract noun is something that you can't touch, like love or happiness. An abstract truth is perhaps something that you can't quite accept or can't quite prove, I think is the better way of putting it. And therefore, Van Helsing is saying in this chapter, in chapter 15, he is going to prove that Lucy is the person who's attacking the children. And you can see there we've got the verb prove, we've got the noun logic. So he's trying to use a scientific process to convince his friend of the truth of his assumption. One of the reasons why he wants to do this is because he wants to get John Seward on side. And this is going to be a really difficult thing to do because John Seward is aware that proving Lucy is somebody who's been attacking children is not something that he wants to actually see come to happen. And he refers here to Byron. A man does not like to prove such a truth. Byron accepted from the category jealousy and prove the very truth he most abhorred. So here we've got interdiscursivity. We've got a quotation taken from a poem written by a poet called Byron. This is interesting on a couple of fronts. In terms of the reason why it is included within the novel, the meaning of this quote is that nobody wants to prove that their jealous feelings towards their lover are founded in reality. It's a horrible thing to discover. Even if you suspect your lover of cheating, it's a horrible thing to discover that they are. So this use of this poem, this interdiscursivity, is useful in helping us to understand Seward's feelings, but also Byron is a romantic poet, and the Gothic genre, even though the novel we're reading is very late Gothic, the Gothic genre has its roots in Romanticism. So, and Byron is obviously a romantic poet. Moving on, Van Helsing says that he wants to use logic to prove that Lucy is in fact this violent creature, and he wants to avoid a madman's logic, which he describes as jumping from tussock to tussock in a misty bog. Now this particular metaphor is quite useful, not least because of the adjective misty, because it connotes that without science, all that you are trying to do with your logical processes are all kind of obfuscated by mist, because you don't have a clear way of seeing that science provides. So that metaphor is quite useful in showcasing how he must have been thinking before. Now he wants to ground those thoughts in a kind of a truth and a proof. Okay. He wants, actually, Seward to be afraid. He wants Seward to feel the horror of discovering this is right, because dread should help my cause, for in it some need of belief. If they are frightened of Lucy, then they will believe him, is the inference here. So how is he going to do this? Well, we spend the night, you and I, in the churchyard where Lucy lies, and then he says, this is the key that lock the tomb. Obviously, nighttime is a time when the vampires arise. So by referring to that particular temporal deixis, we are inviting the reader to anticipate Lucy is going to be seen as a vampire for the first time by one of our homodiegetic narrators. But also the fact that he refers to this key, and he comes back to the key later in the chapter. The key symbolises secrecy, and it symbolises things which are going to be discovered and uncovered, perhaps even things that are repressed. So that particular simple sentence, this is the key that lock the tomb, does a lot more than what it perhaps seems to do on the surface. The next step for Van Helsing and Seward is to visit the hospital wherein the child who was last attacked by the Bloofer lady has been hospitalised. When they get there, they speak to a doctor, Dr. Vincent, who proposes that he thinks it's most likely that a bat has bitten the children. He goes on to explain his thinking. Some sailor may have brought one home and managed to escape, or even from the zoological gardens, a young one may have got loose. The use of the repeated modal verb may shows you that these are all suppositions. They're not founded in logic yet. But what's nice as a reader is that there is an element of truth to this, as we do know that Dracula transforms into a bat when he's attacking Lucy earlier in the novel. Additionally, the anecdote, only 10 days ago a wolf got out, is an anaphoric reference back to the newspaper article we read a few chapters ago, The Escaped Wolf, and therefore this builds up a picture of realism because we have all of the threads of events in the novel coming together. When the child wakes up in the hospital, the doctor says he said he wanted to play with the Bloofer lady. The verb wanted has connotations of desire, and as well we can go back to this word bloofer, which is the phonetic spelling of a child mispronouncing the adjective beautiful. Here we can clearly see that the Bloofer lady, i.e. Lucy in her undead form, is seductive and attractive, and this is the only explanation for why a child who has been injured by her would wish to return to her. After going to the hospital, the sun had dipped and it's become dark. It's really important to think about time in the novel Dracula. After all, Dracula's power waxes and wanes with the rising and falling of the sun, and therefore, if the sun has dipped, what we can anticipate as a reader is that Lucy will be abroad in vampire form. When we're at these points between light and dark, between day and night, between one day and the next, we're in something called a liminal time frame. We're on the threshold between one thing and another. Liminality is a convention of fantasy novels, and therefore it's really great if you can manage to spot it. Anyway, the two characters then go to dine at Jack Straw's castle. This is a real inn, and therefore by using that proper noun we build in additional realism or mimesis. At Jack Straw's castle they see a little crowd of bicyclists, and whilst you might think that this is not particularly useful, this also builds in realism. The 19th century saw a bicycle boom. During this period of time, the design of bikes became vastly improved. The need for bikes became greater as people commuted into work, and therefore this also builds realism. When they get to the churchyard, Seward says, "At last we reached the wall of the churchyard, which we climbed over." Again, quite a basic thing to state. However, what we've got here is another boundary being transgressed. Fantasy novels consistently do this. They push you from one state of belief into another, from one world to another world. So this transgression of boundaries is definitely something to look forward to. Also, it suggests to us that they're doing something wrong, which potentially later in the novel they may do. Again, there's a reference to it being very dark, and because it is dark, it's also described as strange. You can see both the adjective dark and strange are pre-modified by intensifiers. Very dark, so strange. And therefore they become a kind of pair, and we start to think of darkness as being associated with strangeness or other experiences. And within this kind of dark world, we realise that our protagonists are less powerful, less confident. Van Helsing is described here as fumbling. That verb fumbled hardly connotes confidence. When they go into the tomb, which is Lucy's tomb, the description is quite symbolic. This particular extract has been used in examinations before, so it's certainly one to have a look at. In the tomb, the flowers hung lank and dead, their whites turning to rust. So there's quite a lot you can do with this imagery. For one, it's about decomposition, and it shows the natural way of the natural world. This is going to starkly contrast what happens with Lucy. She does not decompose. She is consistently in a state of vivacious liveliness. We've also got the whites turning to rust. Rust is a reddy colour, and therefore white turning to red implies purity turning to passion, just like Lucy does when she transforms from alive to undead. Again, the weakness of the protagonist is suggested in the adjective feeble, which is applied to the candle they hold. At the end of this paragraph, Seward states, "It conveyed irresistibly the idea that life, animal life, was not the only thing which could pass away." So there are many things in this room that feel dead, and that kind of overriding atmosphere of death is obviously something that affects Seward, our narrator. Having accessed the tomb, the next step is to go into the coffin. And Seward is repulsed by the notion of opening the coffin. He says, "It seemed to me as much of an affront to the dead as it would have been to have stripped off her clothing in her sleep whilst living." And whilst this seems like a peculiar simile, it's very useful because it starts to help us with equating their treatment of the dead Lucy with the treatment of a passive sleeping woman. There's a voyeurism involved here. there is certainly a misogynist tone of manipulating a woman's body because she is an object, and that is acceptable. So there's a disturbing undertone of sensuality, and not in a good way, in this chapter. And that's really clear. I mean, when Van Helsing's trying to access the coffin, the verbs that are used are really violent: striking and stab. And this is just to open up the coffin. So there's a little bit of foreshadowing here as to how Lucy will be killed as an undead woman. As the coffin lid is opened, Seward says, "I had expected a rush of gas from the weak old corpse." That sentence is very direct, very graphic, very upsetting. The reason why it's included here is because it adds to the morbid sense of excitement. And this is certainly a moment in the text that I would suggest is very sensationalized. It links to what Henry Mansell said about sensational novels, that they are the morbid phenomena of literature, that it's all about excitement and excitement alone. This is disgusting, this language. And yet it has a purpose. You kind of shrink from the book, you're repulsed by the book in the same way that Seward is. So it has a function. Okay, on looking in the coffin is found to be empty, and there's a juxtaposition between the two reactions here. Seward suffers a considerable shock, so that noun shock, and Van Helsing is described as unmoved. This adjective is a direct contrast with the noun shock, and it shows you that Van Helsing predicted this, whereas Seward did not. So Van Helsing is the one with knowledge, and Seward is the one with ignorance. Seward continues to think there's got to be a rational reason why this body is not in the coffin, and one of the reasons he suggested is there might have been a body snatcher. Again, a kind of sensational choice. Body snatchers, those people who dig up graves and exhume bodies without permission, are a kind of gross and deeply immoral, unpleasant strata of society, and in alluding to them, it's certainly very morbid. The decision is that they are going to spend the night in the churchyard to see if they can gather any more information. Where has this body gone? So they decide to separate in the churchyard, and Seward says, I saw his dark figure move until the intervening headstones and trees hid it from my sight. This final clause on this slide suggests to you he's alone and he's vulnerable. So I talked a little bit about liminal time frames. Again, we've got another one here. Whilst he is on his lonely vigil, that simple sentence again connoting his vulnerability, Seward hears a distant clock strike 12. Well, you might be thinking, well, it's dark now, so it's not in a liminal time frame because we're not between light and dark. But at 12, we are between one day and the next. And therefore, again, it is a liminal time frame. It is the threshold between one state of existence and another. Whilst waiting in the churchyard, Seward says, I was chilled and unnerved and angry. This is a polysyndetic list with two repeated conjunctions, and it tells us that being placed into this situation is forcing Seward to get angry, to have an emotional reaction, and it's that last adjective that is useful. Seward is going to have a build-up of anger in this chapter because he is consistently psychologically resisting the concept that Lucy might have turned into an undead creature. Anyway, whilst he's in that state of anger, he suddenly sees something like a white streak. That simile is very useful. It reminds us of the White Lady saw in Whitby Abbey, who is a kind of ghost figure. So it has links to these ideas of the supernatural. But also white is useful. It implies purity, and here we're going to clearly see that the purity of Lucy has been abused by Dracula's transformation of her. There's something or she's almost a parody of herself here, while she's all dressed in white whilst doing something awful. And you can see I've highlighted in orange the repetition of that adjective, a white dim figure, the white figure. And even though there's a repetition of the adjective, there's also lots of ambiguous lots of ambiguous language. For example, the pronoun something and the noun figure. Those are all ambiguous lexical choices. So there's something about Lucy that's not quite human, not quite right. Having seen her arrive on the churchyard, Seward is struggling to get into position. He's described as stumbling. This is a little bit like Van Helsing, who was described as fumbling earlier. The heroes don't seem in control, they don't seem powerful, and therefore they have a nice contrast and a nice juxtaposition with the elegant confidence of this white streak that is Lucy. An early cock crows, so again liminal time frames, we're moving towards day. And the next thing that happens is that when the white figure disappears into the tomb, we find the professor holding in his arms a tiny child. Now, it's interesting here because there's a couple of things we can infer from this sentence that I've circled with the red there. The fact that the child is tiny, it implies to us the horror of Lucy's transformation. Previously, she was attacking children who were fully able to articulate themselves, fully able to talk. Now this is a tiny child, almost like a baby, and that pre-modifier tells you how perturbing her transformation has become. But also the fact that the professor is holding that tiny child in his arms. The preposition phrase, in his arms, refers to him again in that paternal light as a father figure, and a tender father figure at that. Having seen this poor tiny child who potentially has been attacked, Seward is still really angry, really aggressive. No, I said, in a way that I felt was aggressive. And I think what's interesting here is that he knows he's behaving in a way which is more angry than he should be, more aggressive than he should be, but he can't control his emotions at this point because he's so threatened by the idea of Lucy becoming violent, or her becoming a threat, if you like. So they now have this child. There is something of a problem. What do they do with the child? They decide they can't go to a policeman because he will try and make them explain what on earth they're doing in a churchyard at night. So they decide, bottom of the slide, we decided that we should take it to the heath, and when we heard a policeman coming, would leave it where he would not fail to find it. So at all points, they are protecting themselves from the institutions and systems which we would have thought would have dealt with any kind of foreign invasion or threat. If you felt that there was a foreign invasion or a threat to your country, you would probably go to see the police. But because this threat is supernatural in nature, they cannot do that because there isn't a logical explanation for what's ongoing. As they go back after leaving this child with the policeman, they go past the Spaniards, another proper noun for a real place used to generate realism, and Van Helsing says the next day they're going to go on another expedition. The noun expedition has connotations of adventure and excitement, and therefore suggests to you that Van Helsing is enjoying this. He is not a completely morally black and white character, and he's allowed to be like that because he is foreign himself. Our English characters have to have much greater moral fibre to flatter and create positive faith with the British readership. So the second expedition to the churchyard takes place at daylight, and therefore Lucy is not likely to be in a vampiric state. At this point, Seward writes, "Again I felt that horrid sense of the reality of things in which any effort of imagination seemed out of place." This is a really useful sentence, as it involves the juxtaposition of the abstract noun reality and the abstract noun imagination. And it sells to us the idea that Lucy walking abroad out of her tomb is real and he can't imagine anything like it. So the fantasy is becoming the reality here. At this point, he realizes the perils of the law which we were incurring in our unhallowed work. So this particular clause alludes to the fact that they're doing something illegal by breaking into the churchyard, breaking into a tomb, exhuming a body without permission. So the perils of the law refers to this. And the noun phrase unhallowed work tells you that what they are doing doesn't just seem illegal, it also seems unholy, immoral, if you like. So Seward is having some inner conflict at this stage within the chapter. However, that inner conflict is made much more complex by the fact that when they open the coffin on this particular day, Lucy is inside the coffin. However, she is far more beautiful. She was, if possible, more radiantly beautiful than ever. So obviously we can pick out the adjective beautiful, which has been pre-modified a couple of times by more radiantly. She has become more gorgeous, more attractive, more seductive. And this is something that deeply upsets Seward. In fact, it causes him to doubt. He uses the epistemic modality, "I could not believe that she was dead." And then he points out that her lips are red, nay, redder than before. The amplification of the adjective red to the comparative adjective redder tells you that she's grown more and more attractive. So this comes back to the idea that as a undead creature, she is increasingly seductive. At this point, Van Helsing starts to manipulate the body, and there is something as a woman reading today in modern society, I find this particular passage really disturbing. Whilst the woman is laid there passive, Van Helsing starts to pull back the lips to look at the teeth, and a little bit later he raises the eyelids to look at the eyes, and again opens the lips to examine the teeth. All of this, the penetrative nature of it, the revealing nature of these verbs, pulled back, opening, examining, raising, it suggests to you something about, about attitudes in society to women. It's okay to manipulate a passive woman's body, but it also indicates to you that Lucy is not really a human anymore to them. And it's not a surprise, therefore, that Seward, whilst he is doing this, has an argumentative hostility awoken within him. That personification there is quite useful, as it tells you that he's still resisting this notion that she is evil, but perhaps he's also resisting the notion that it's acceptable to manipulate a woman's body in this way. So on this slide, we start to think perhaps a little bit more about Phyllis Roth's essay on the persecution of the suddenly sexual women in Dracula. Whilst looking at the body and assuming that there is some kind of dual life there, Van Helsing gives us some exposition. That means some information that we previously haven't had. He says, "She was bitten by the vampire when she was in a trance, sleepwalking. And in a trance, could he best come to take more blood? In trance, she died, and in trance, she is undead." So what we learn here is that Lucy is not a normal vampire. Unlike Dracula, who is autonomous and can completely understand his actions and articulate what he's doing in his vampiric mode, Lucy is not in control. She is in a trance. So whilst she is out biting the children, she is not fully in control of herself. She's still kind of hypnotized. She still feels like she's in a dream. Okay, and the ramifications of that is this, it make hard that I must kill her in her sleep. So what it points out is that Lucy will never look evil because she will always look like she's in a trance, and therefore Van Helsing, when he wants to destroy this undead figure, will have to do so whilst she is asleep, while she's passive, whilst she seems innocent. And while Seward is listening to this, he starts to realise, or he starts to believe, that there is some fairness in what Van Helsing is saying. He says, if she were really dead, what was then of terror in the idea of killing her? And that rhetorical question helps you to understand that Seward is starting to believe in Van Helsing's theories. And because he is doing this, Van Helsing is overjoyed. That's clear in the adverb joyously. There's a kind of righteous enjoyment in the conception that they can kill this person. They can destroy this person's body. And that adverb, worryingly, is followed by the following quote. So Van Helsing says, after the interrogative, how will you do this bloody work? He says, I shall cut off her head and fill her mouth with garlic, and I shall drive a stake through her body. This compound sentence gives you three clauses, three pieces of information. He's got to do three things: cut off her head, fill her mouth with garlic, drive a stake through her body. There is an objective tone here. There is no emotion. It is a declarative. There's a confidence in those modal verbs, I shall. And therefore, it's more upsetting, it's more disturbing. At least that's how I feel as a reader. Seward does not feel that disturbed. Initially he shudders, but then he says, the feeling was not so strong as I had expected. I was in fact beginning to shudder at the presence of this being, this undead, to loathe it. So here, what Seward is feeling with that verb loathe, he is feeling a morbid dread, and that's because he morbidly desires her. Okay, he really desires this Lucy with her redder than red lips and her radiant skin, and therefore, you know, it's more frightening to him. She's more frightening to him. And he's starting to justify this idea that he can drive a stake through her body. Obviously, driving a stake through her body is a penetrative act. And we talked before about how vampirism is kind of synonymous with sex, the exchange of bodily fluids, but also driving a stake through a vampire is also synonymous with sex because it is penetrative, but it's just more violent. If anything, it's more akin to rape. So, yeah, there's an unsettling tone to this passage within the novel. There is a problem, of course. Van Helsing perceives Arthur to be his son, and therefore he wants Arthur to be involved in the decision to stake and decapitate Lucy. There is a problem. He may think that in some more mistaken idea this woman was buried alive, and that in most mistake of all we have killed her. This will paint his dreams with horror. So the concern is that in seeing Lucy in her radiance, Arthur will think that she's alive, and then he will think that their staking of her is the true death, and this will very much frighten him. However, Van Helsing feels resolute that this is something they must do, and that is clear in the bottom thing that I circled here. Now, since I know it is all true, 100,000 times more do I know that he must enact this, if you like. So he is still resolute, even though he anticipates in advance that Arthur will not receive the news of Lucy's decapitation warmly. Again, speaking of Arthur, Van Helsing states, he, poor fellow, must have 1 hour that will make the very face of heaven go black to him. any kind of imagery that is to do with transformation from light to dark is symbolic of Lucy's transformation, is symbolic of the transformation of human to vampire. So obviously that's the reason why that is used here. We then have a note left by Van Helsing for Seward after they've left the churchyard. He writes because he's going to spend the night in the churchyard without Seward, and let's say something happens to him, he wants to just give him advice on how to proceed. Van Helsing's plan is to place garlic and a crucifix around her so that she is sealed in the tomb. He says she is young as undead and will heed. There's a sort of, again, paternal tone to that sentence. He's talking about the young and whether they listen or whether they don't. But also he's moving on to explain why it is he fears a little for his life. He's going to be in there from sunset until sunrise. Those are two liminal time frames, as they are both when the sun is setting, so light is going out, and when the sun is rising, so when light is arriving. And therefore he's going to be within this particular location when it is most dangerous, when vampires could arrive. One of the reasons why he fears for his life is because of the green sentence that I've highlighted here. For Miss Lucy, or from her, I have no fear. So he's not scared of Lucy. But that other, to whom is there that she is undead, he have now the power to seek her tomb and find shelter. So this is another piece of exposition and another piece of information. Because Lucy has been transformed into a vampire, Dracula can now use her tomb to take shelter. He doesn't just need to use his boxes, he can use her box too, her tomb, her coffin. So the notion is that perhaps Dracula might try and visit her, and if he did, Van Helsing would be unable to fight him. And you can see I've circled in blue here a couple of points as to why he can't fight Dracula on his own. Because of his supernatural capabilities. He has the strength in his hand of 20 men. He can summon his wolf. So the verb summon implies a kind of supernatural power. However, he still rationalises that he thinks he's going to survive the night. The reason being that Dracula's hunting ground is more full of game than the churchyard. So he's pointing out that Dracula is like a hunter, used through this metaphor, and the city is more full of prey than the churchyard. So humans here within this metaphor are described as quarry, as prey, and Dracula is hunting them down. So the final direction that I'm going to cover in this PowerPoint, the other one's much shorter because, as I said, this is quite a short chapter. He gives us this imperative. He says to Seward, this is what you need to do. Take the papers that are with this, the diaries of Harker and the rest, and read them, and then find this great undead, and cut off his head, and burn his heart, or drive a stake through it, so that the world may rest from him. There's a tone of desperation within this particular imperative. You can see there's quite a lot of polysyndeton, the diaries of Harker and the rest, and read them, and then find this great undead, and cut off his head, and burn his heart. So there's a tone of desperation, there's a lot to be done, and he's suggesting almost that Seward is the person to take on this role. If Van Helsing is to die, Seward must become empowered and become a leader.